Good morning, Fred. Thank you so much for joining us here on Demo Day for our FinTech Innovation Lab. We really appreciate you taking the time. And
My pleasure.
it's our 10th anniversary. It's not exactly how we were planning to spend the 10th anniversary on Zoom, but here we are. So thank you for being flexible and joining us this morning. I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
So let's get right into it. Here we are. We are, I guess, now day 110 or something for post the pause in New York City for COVID-19. So let's start with that. You know, as you've been seeing it, what have been the major impacts on venture, on tech, of the shutdown, of the COVID? So what are you seeing?
Well, you know, I have a little bit of a bird's eye view into this, not only because of our portfolio, but also because I'm the chairman of Tech NYC, which is the sort of the tech association in New York City, and I've talked to a lot of members of that organization. And you know, I think that the tech sector probably has come through the COVID pandemic better than most industries. I think that's because a lot of the products and services that the tech sector delivers are delivered in software, and so you know, they were not as negatively impacted. And I also think that you know, the pivot to working remotely went pretty well for most companies. I think much better than most companies would have thought it had gone. So for me, the big takeaways are that the tech sector may have actually been a beneficiary in a small way from the pandemic, in that a number of sectors saw a pretty significant uptake of their service. A good example of this is online food delivery, which I've been told only about 3% of the US households were using online food delivery before the pandemic, and at its peak, that number was north of 30%. And while I don't think that all of those households will come back, will continue to use online food delivery, many of them will, right? So it was a big sort of adoption moment for that. And there are a lot of other examples of that as well: online learning, telehealth, remote work, things like that. So I think it's not that all tech companies came through unscathed, but I think a lot of tech companies came through largely unscathed, and some tech companies actually saw their businesses improve. Particularly companies in e-commerce, I think, could be a sector that's probably done particularly well. So it is it's been a relatively painless moment for the tech sector, but it has been a very painful moment for many people and many industries. And so, it doesn't necessarily feel all that good that the tech sector, was spared, because, there's so much damage, all around us. But, I do think that specifically tech has come through pretty well.
So I think, just to flip that around, then that actually the good news of that is that tech then is likely going to be a really significant engine of growth for the economy, because particularly in New York City, we've got a pretty big hole that we're going to need to fill. And so any thoughts on how they can contribute to that? Because I think we need economic engines to get us out of this crisis.
Well, hiring, right? I think the tech sector has got to get back to hiring. And I do believe that many tech companies paused hiring. We saw at Union Square Ventures, we keep a job board, and we saw the open positions go from about 1,500 down to about 800 during the pandemic. And that's all across our portfolio. So that's not just in New York. So many companies paused hiring, but I think it's time that the tech sector get back to hiring. So that's one way I think that the tech sector can help New York recover. And I think another way the tech sector can help New York recover is getting people back in offices and working again. That's challenging for a couple reasons. One is that some employees aren't going to feel safe going back to the office, and also many people are not going to feel that comfortable riding the subways. So one thing I think is interesting is the possibility that companies will start to create maybe satellite offices, which I think could be really interesting. If you could imagine,
spread the wealth a little bit. So
correct.
Yeah, so it's not so concentrated in, the Union Square areas, 14th to 23rd Street, but actually out in Brooklyn or out in Queens or up in the Bronx.
I think that would be terrific if you saw a company like Google or Facebook have a satellite office in Brooklyn and a satellite office in Queens and a satellite office in the Bronx. Not only would that be great for their employees who live in those neighborhoods, much easier to get to work, but it would also start to engage them in those communities, right? And and that's one thing I think that isn't good about New York tech is that it has been so Manhattan focused. And so I think a lot of tech companies don't really think about the outer boroughs and the broader, New York City community as much as maybe they could or should. So I'm hopeful that maybe the need to be more responsive to the transportation issues will, maybe help with that.
And I neglected to say Staten Island. We could have offices in Staten Island.
Of course.
So do you think the trend to work from home, how's that going to, there's been a lot of chatter around a number of companies saying people can work from home or remotely permanently. Do you think that's going to be a long-term trend, or is that just while we get through, until there's a vaccine and people feel safer being around other people in groups?
I think that the pandemic has taught us two things about that. One is that people can be very productive working from home, much more than maybe we thought they could. And distributed teams can be much more productive working in that way than we thought they would. So that's one thing we've learned that I think will cause companies to be more open to that way of working. But I think the other thing we've learned is the exact opposite, which is how much we all want to get back to the office and be with each other, working with each other. So I think what we're likely to see is not a wholesale move to work from home or remote work culture, but one that is more accepting of that when someone's got a sick child or some other situation that makes it harder for them to go to work. I think companies are going to be much more comfortable with the idea that someone can be productive working from home. But I also think that companies are going to want and create the right incentives for people to continue to want to work together in an office. So I think that's just going to mean being creative and creating new ways of working, like the one that we were talking about, like a hub and spoke model with satellites, or a day or two a week where people are encouraged to come to the office. So I think then the big fear that Tech NYC has is that the tech companies in New York are going to move out of New York, or they're going to allow their employees to move out of New York, and it's going to be a drain on the talent pool in New York. I think that there's something to be worried about there, but I don't think it's as significant of a risk as some people think.
Their venture capitalist said that New York will be back when the FOMO is back, the fear of missing out, right? That you have to be at that event, you have to be at that meeting, because otherwise you're going to miss out. So I think FOMO will be our friend on the side.
I mean, I think most people agree that we will at some point have a vaccine and or some sort of therapeutic cure for the disease, and that at that time, all the things that are standing in the way will go away. And I think we can return to working the way we used to work, but I don't think it'll be a complete return. I think there will be some things that will change, and I think the changes will be a little more subtle than people think, but I do think there will be changes.
So let's switch to venture. So what are you seeing in the venture community in terms of are deals getting funded, are people funds raising money, what's happening to valuations, and then how many people are investing in entrepreneurs that they've met on a video conference but never in person? And do you think how's that going to work over the next, say, 18 months when we're not really getting together as much?
So when everybody, left their offices and started working from home, and the economy started losing millions of jobs, a lot of people thought that the venture industry would contract, and that hasn't really happened. I haven't seen the data, but anecdotally, I think that the venture industry has been about as active in the second quarter as it was in the first quarter. And some of that is because, as I explained earlier on, the tech sector has not really been that badly impacted. And then also, a lot of money has been raised over the past 2 or 3 years into venture funds, and it's our job to deploy that capital. We can't just sit on the capital taking management fees. So I think the combination of those two things has caused the venture industry to remain quite active, surprisingly so, I think. And we have been too. We had a very busy first quarter, actually the busiest quarter ever in the history of USV. And we thought that the second quarter would be significantly down from that. And it's down a little bit, but not a lot. And I'd say the second quarter is probably one of the top 5 quarters that we've ever had at USV. So we continue to be quite active, and we see that with lots of other firms as well. The second issue that you raised is one that surprised me, honestly. I am seeing a lot of transactions happen where we're meeting teams over Zoom and ultimately deciding to invest in them. We went back and looked at it when this whole thing hit. We went back and looked.
Those are people where the first meeting was on Zoom? You hadn't met them in person before?
Yes. And we went back and looked at this. In the history of USV, we had done that 3 times before the pandemic. Literally 3 companies that we had invested in out of maybe 100 over the history of USV were people that we never met in person before we put the money into the company. So that, and those 3 companies performed as well or better than average, right? So that gave us some confidence that we could do that, and we've now done that another 3 or 4 times. So I'm not saying that that's ideal, but it is interesting that if you're willing to do that, it also is possible that you could increase the geographic scope of where you might be willing to invest, right? If you're really willing to invest in somebody that you've never met in person, does that mean you could invest in companies in Asia or South Asia or Africa? Now, we haven't taken that leap. We haven't said, oh, if we can do this, why does geography matter? But I do think that it's a logical question, and that we may see the venture industry become more ambitious in terms of geographic investing because of that.
Or just bringing it back to New York, could be upstate New York, right? Because there's a dearth of venture capital in upstate New York, and that could be an interesting way to open that up.
Well, talking about upstate New York is interesting. So the one thing that I have seen pretty dramatically is founders and senior tech executives, engineers, increasingly being interested in relocating out of the city into, upstate New York, call it 2 hours away or something like that, right? Where they could build a company, up in the Catskill region or something like that, where, the quality of life for some people might be better and the cost of living might be better, and it's still close enough to New York City. And again, I don't think that we're going to see a wholesale migration of the tech sector out of Manhattan up to the Catskill region, but I do think that we will see a number of companies make that choice, and you could see how it could work, right? It's a 2-hour train ride.
Sure.
It could happen.
Yeah, and then you've got access to some of the talent from some of the schools that are upstate, Syracuse,
right.
Rensselaer, etc. Something to watch. So then, sort of shifting to, I guess, pulling back the curtain a little bit. So what are some of the new sectors or technologies that you're looking at? Is there anything about the COVID situation that has shifted the kinds of companies you're looking for, the technologies you're looking for? So where's where you're looking like these days?
Surprisingly, we have not had an aha moment in the past 3 months about some new sector that all of a sudden got our attention. I would have hoped that that could have happened, but it didn't happen. Instead, what happened is that we saw a number of sectors that we had been investing in over the past 5 to 10 years have a inflection point in their growth curves. Things like telehealth, things like online learning, things like software to make it easier for remote workforces to work together. And so that has given us, I think, more enthusiasm for those sectors, and we have increased our appetite, which was already pretty significant in those sectors. But, you know, you would think that maybe something like, you know, augmented reality or virtual reality would have had a moment during this pandemic, and we didn't see that. We saw a bunch of people experiment with creating online conferences in, you know, video game-like environments, but the experiences, and we tried a bunch of those, but the experiences still didn't feel quite right. So it doesn't mean that that a whole bunch of founders will get inspired and that in 6 months or a year or 2 years, we will start to see some of that. But we have not found that that was as productive of an area to look at as we thought it might be. So
it's hard to replace the human experience.
Yeah.
Really.
Say that again?
It's hard to replace the human experience.
I think so. I think that that's one of the great lessons is that we take a lot of that for granted. You know, a good example is I'm doing a fireside chat with you right here, right now. If I was doing that fireside chat with you at a physical demo day, there would be an opportunity for all the founders and the teams to network with me and talk to me either before or after this conversation. And we're not going to have that opportunity now.
Right.
So
it's those 3-minute conversations where you can get an incredible amount of stuff done that don't happen. That's
right.
I think of all the information gets conveyed, it's those 3-minute conversations where, you know, business is done, connections are made, introductions are followed up on that we're missing. And that's hard.
Yeah, and I really believe that it's very easy in the venture capital business to live inside of your own, you know, existing networks. And that's why, for example, the venture industry has been slow to embrace gender balance, and it's been slow to embrace people of color. And these are not good things. These are bad things. And so I'm not defending the venture industry. I think we need to change. And it is those serendipitous moments where you have the opportunity to go outside of your existing networks. When I grew up in the venture business in my 20s, it was I mean, it's still in some ways, you know, an old boys club, but it was even more that way in the 80s. I mean, literally there was 20 or 30 firms and they shared deals with each other. And if you couldn't get into that network, you couldn't raise money.
Yeah, you weren't a venture capitalist. You were something
right.
else. Yeah.
But now it's more wide open, but not anywhere near as wide open as it needs to be. And of course, things like, you know, what you're doing right here with the various incubator and accelerator programs that you operate, you know, is super important. And, you know, that allows people to get access to investors that might not have it as much as they need it. So I think that the industry has improved a lot over the past decade or two in this regard, but it's still not where it needs to be. And the lack of, taking it back to where we started with this discussion, the lack of the in-person events and networking opportunities is a negative right now.
Yeah. we've actually found, I think the 10 companies that were in this year's program that you all are hearing from on our demo day, had very interesting access during this pandemic because we had excellent engagement from our 43 financial institution partners. They all showed up, they all made themselves available. It actually, I think, helped that bankers were not traveling. They do a lot of traveling, and they were actually, here and available for meetings. So,
Maria, let me just drill down on that a little bit. I think there's something that did happen in this in the last 3 months that hopefully will continue to happen, which is it's way easier for me to say, yeah, Maria, I'll come on Zoom and talk to you for 45 minutes or an hour than it is for me to even get on a subway and go to an event, right? Because the extra 30 minutes of getting to the event and then the extra 30 minutes at the event after the conversation and then the extra 30 minutes getting back to my office turns a 45-minute conversation into a 3-hour hold on my calendar, right? So again, I'm not saying that this is entirely a good thing, but what I have found is I've been way more available to lots of people who would have a hard time getting a meeting in my office with me. And I've taken a lot more meetings as a result. And I think the same things happened with, all of the partners in your program. I think you say, this company needs, 30 minutes of your time. It's easier for someone to say, yeah, let's hop on Zoom and I'll give you 30 minutes because they realize they're really only giving 30 minutes.
Right.
So it's more efficient. And so I think that in many ways, it's been easier to get people's time and attention, and that's
it's been
really
more
good
efficient with the people but it's
right.
What it's cut out are access to people that you don't have relationships with. So
Right.
I think that's the key differentiator, and that's the benefit of sort of all online is it is it's more open within a closed circle, but it is still, but you shut off as you said, the serendipitous encounters and the ability to expand the circle. So anyway, it's interesting. And so where we may go then is a blend of the two, right? You may then do more Zoom meetings with the people you've already met. You don't need to go see them in person. You met them once and then the follow-up can all be by Zoom, but you still want to be out there meeting the new people that you haven't, would normally not cross paths with.
Yeah, I think that is actually a really interesting framework to think about where we go coming out of this. I think what we'll do is we'll very much embrace the things that we've missed being able to do, the in-person things, but we'll also remember that there was a bunch of things that were more efficient about a day where, I know that these are exhausting days, but I've had days where I've literally done a dozen meetings.
Yeah. And you're exhausted, right? From sitting is exhausting. But yeah, no, I think we've all had days like that. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of it. Let me just pick on, the tech sector has not been quiet. The broader tech sector has not been quiet through all of this. And so I'm going to sort of zoom out into some industry questions, which is the big tech companies in particular have been very active. And they seem to have been increasing market share. They've got the scale, they've got the resources to do things differently during this environment. So is there a long-term risk that as they increase their power and their position, that becomes a limit on innovation? And how does, as their scale and scope increases, how does a younger company, the kinds that you're investing in, think about competing with them?
This is something that we've been talking a lot about and been concerned about for really the past decade, is the emergence of these super, super powerful tech companies like Apple and Amazon and Google and Facebook and many others. I mean, those are the obvious ones, but they're Microsoft. And I think they are getting more powerful. But what I haven't seen, with some limited exceptions, what I haven't seen is that increased market power make it harder to build a company. one example in our portfolio, Google has a product called Google Classroom, and we had a company in our portfolio called Edmodo, which built something that was very similar to Google Classroom long before Google created Google Classroom. And they had a good business and they were really growing nicely. And Google really wanted to get Google Docs and Google Mail and Google Calendar broadly adopted in the K-12 system. And so they kept hearing, well, we need, this basically, we need a digital classroom. And so they created Google Classroom, not necessarily to put Edmodo out of business, but because they wanted to increase the adoption of other products. But they made it free, and the net of it is they kind of put Edmodo out of business. So there are examples of that where a big company, comes into a market with a free product and just devastates a small company. But the reality is, I think that's really the exception. And, I look at the 100+ companies that we funded over the past decade and a half, and I have a hard time finding a single one of them that has been significantly negatively impacted by the growing market power of the large companies. It's still a concern, but I think that the opportunity to innovate is so large. What's really happening is that digital technologies, digital work, digital commerce is taking share from other ways of doing business. And so if we see, 30% of the economy now moving digital, within that, maybe half of that opportunity is being soaked up by the big 5 or the big 10, but there's still so much more out there for us all to go after. So I don't think it should be a reason for anybody not to start a company.
Yeah, that's we've been very active with the NTA and the public transit systems in New York, and that's been really interesting to watch, is their embrace of digital technologies, because that's effectively what we're doing with them, is helping them get access to new digital tools, test them, pilot them, and ultimately adopt them. So,
well, I think, by the way, that this pandemic is an interesting moment for these transportation systems. If you go to Asia, for example, you see much more technology in their mass transit systems because they're more modern and they're younger. I mean, our system's 100 and some years old, right? Yeah. But for example, I don't know that the city will do this, but imagine if every subway turnstile had a temperature scanner in it, and so you were just able to instantly know if somebody was carrying a fever when they walked through a turnstile. Now, for the COVID pandemic, that would have been super useful. But I think in general, being able to, protect our systems, our transportation systems, not just from people carrying diseases, but all sorts of other potentially bad things, is something that we're going to need to do. And that's largely going to be technology.
Another big issue in tech is privacy. And with all the increasing data that are in the hands of the big enterprise companies, different agencies, what are your thoughts on that long-term balance between data, privacy, convenience, and particularly right now with COVID, the need for public health to know where people are that may have had COVID and to do the contact tracing. That in itself has raised a whole separate set of issues. But it gets to that core issue of privacy versus convenience, and in this case, public health. So
I think we will see more and more privacy legislation, GDPR in Europe, and I forget what it's called. It's the California privacy legislation.
California privacy, yeah. And New York is working on a privacy regulation.
So we're going to see more of that, and companies are going to have to comply. And I think that's a good thing. Although, like all regulations, I wish they were written in a less bureaucratic and cumbersome way. But nevertheless, GDPR, for all its faults, I think has been good for the industry and has caused people to clean up their act pretty significantly. And so I don't love the legislation necessarily, but I believe that it's ultimately going to help having rules that people have to follow. And then also, I think companies can compete with the big dominant tech companies by creating privacy-focused competitors. The best example, the one I love, happens to be a USV portfolio company, is our search company, DuckDuckGo, which is a private search engine. So they promise that they do not store any of your searches and they do not use any of your search data to improve their search engine. Now that results in a slightly less good search engine, but what has happened is that now close to 2% of all searches in the US and more than 1% of all searches around the world are being done on the DuckDuckGo search engine. So you might say, well, that's not a particularly large share of the market, but it turns out it's actually a lot of searches. And they've been able to build, a really, really good business. And so people should do that in email, and people should do that in social media, and people should do that in all of the big categories, and just compete on the basis of privacy. That will do two things. One, it'll give people a private option if they want it. It will also force the big companies to see that that's a competitive vector against their business and may cause them to adapt, and change their ways to protect their franchises. So
the privacy as a service could be a new category.
And there are people doing it. Now, the thing that's challenging is that most people will not change their behavior just to get privacy. So and DuckDuckGo is not as good as Google, right? So, the only people who really use DuckDuckGo are the people who care more about privacy than the average person by a fair measure. And so
that would be me. Yes, that's my search engine of choice. So yes, I will agree with everything you're saying about DuckDuckGo. Yeah. So
the funny thing is that people say they care about privacy, but my dad used to say to me, Fred, watch what people do, not what they say.
Right.
And if you watch what people do with respect to privacy, it is that they use services every single day which are not very good on the privacy issue, and they don't change and use the more private options. But I am optimistic that over time the private options will get better, people will care more, and we will see this become a more important thing in tech, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah. When there are consequences, when people see more consequences in their daily life about the lack of privacy, then people pay attention. It's because it's at the end of the day, it's all personal.
But I like the way that the contact tracing, or I like to actually call it exposure alerting, because contact tracing to is the thing that public health, organizations have been doing for like thousands of years, which is, manually tracking down people who might be infected. And I think that's super important, and we have to continue to do it. The thing that we can do with mobile phones using Bluetooth handshakes is potentially alert somebody, hey, you were with somebody in the last week who we just found out tested positive, you should go get tested. That's, I think, pretty valuable. And I like the fact that Google and Apple have committed to build the foundational technology for that into their phones, let people opt in or opt out of it, which is a really good thing for privacy. In a pandemic, you might want to opt into it, but once there's a vaccine or some other thing and the pandemic goes away, then you can opt out of it. So you're not giving Google and Apple and everybody else, your data forever and ever. And then the other thing that's nice about the Google and Apple technology is that the handshake data is encrypted on the phone, and so it's not available just to anybody, right? It's secure and safe on the phone unless that data needs to be made available to somebody else because you end up being infected. So, there's a lot of people who are wringing their hands over this issue, and I think rightly so, but I also think that what Google and Apple did here was pretty intelligent, and I think largely the right response. in many dimensions. So I actually I'm a fan of that.
So Union Square was an investor in another company that's been very much in the news, Twitter, and is specifically been in the news for the fact checking that they've started to do. And so on a more general level, what are your thoughts around the talk now, the social media platform should be treated as publishers or distributors? Should there be changes to Section 230, the regulation of content? Sort of that's a whole new area that's sort of come to the forefront.
Right. Well, with respect to Section 230, I think we got to be careful, because if we expose platforms to liabilities that they have not been exposed to before, they may change their ways of doing business to protect themselves. And so that could mean that they will stop doing certain things that we actually want them to do. So the law of unintended consequences is a really interesting thing to think about. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't potentially play around with 230 on the edges to try to make it better. But I think the idea of all of a sudden saying to these companies, you're publishers and you're exposed to all the liability that publishers are, probably not going to end up being a good thing. So we got to be careful about that. With respect to the fact checking, I kind of wish Twitter had been doing this for a long time, and I would like to see them do it not just with the president's tweets, but with the tweets of anybody who is maybe a verified person on Twitter. So to say that, or maybe they create another category. Today, it's either you're just a regular user of Twitter, or you're a verified user of Twitter. And the verified users of Twitter basically have sort of a slightly higher level of that they are who they say they are, right? So maybe Twitter should create an even higher category, which are people that are influencers, people of influence, right? And if they had that, I think that they should be fact checking the tweets of people of influence.
Yeah, and you could do that based on the number of followers they have. You get above a certain level, you have that. Then you define influence based on number of followers, and it's automatic. Right. So therefore, you take the judgment out of it. So you have more than X followers, you're an influencer.
Right. And if a tweet is making an assertion that is not crystal clear that it's true, then I think putting some sort of list to here's what the facts are, I think is totally valid. In fact, I think it's a great reaction, because the idea that Twitter should censor those tweets, these are people of influence, right? And so in a way, you want to give them the opportunity to speak publicly, but you also want a mechanism to make sure that people have the opportunity to see whether or not what they're saying is in fact accurate. So I would rather see them do what they're doing and do it more broadly than them just taking down tweets that are potentially problematic.
Yeah, and because Twitter's become such an important part of so many facets of people's lives, in particular, movements. And so I want to, with that, go back to something you mentioned briefly at the beginning, but which is very much in all of our minds, which is George Floyd, the social justice movement, and the need to have the world do things differently. So we will never go back, and to some things we should not go back to, and this will be one of them. So as you mentioned that venture has been, was traditionally a very sort of white male environment, with not a lot of diversity either of gender or economic background or ethnic background. So what are some concrete things that you think the venture community, the tech community, who suffers from a similar set of issues, can do to address some of the equities that exist in the industry?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things that we can and should and will do. But I think maybe the simplest way to frame it is that 5 to 10 years ago, the issues around gender equity in venture became loud enough and painful enough that many in the venture industry realized that they just had to change the way they were behaving. And if you look at the progress that the venture industry made and the broader tech sector has made with respect to gender equity over the past 5 years, is pretty significant. We're not yet at a 50-50 ratio on boards. We're not yet on a 50-50 ratio in venture partnerships. CEOs are not 50% women. Management teams aren't 50% women. But if you plotted the curves, they're all up and to the right pretty significantly. And if we keep going up and to the right on gender, we're going to get there in, I don't know, another 10 years maybe, which is a long time. I realize many people think that's too long, but I'm just saying that, you know, we're going in the right direction. And so I think we have to do the exact same thing with race, and particularly with underrepresented minorities, people of color. And I think that we will, because, you know, having witnessed what happened with respect to the gender conversation, I feel like the exact same thing is happening now with respect to race. And so I have a lot of confidence that the wheels are in motion in every company, and every board, and every venture firm in a way that they really weren't before. And I don't totally understand why it took this event to happen. Like, why didn't it happen, you know, with Eric Gardner? Or why didn't it like, why, you know, why now? Like, why did it have to wait until now? I don't understand that. And
I'll leave that to the historians to figure that out.
But I feel it in a very real way. So that's the most important thing. And at Unisquare Ventures, we've committed ourselves to fixing the issues that we have inside our firm. We're also advocating strongly with respect to our portfolio companies where we have influence. But I think, and I think that's happening in many venture firms and many boards and many management teams. So that's all good. I also think we have to continue to make other investments. It's easy to say this is a pipeline issue. It's not just a pipeline issue. And so we have to do the things that we're all doing now to open up these opportunities. But it is also a pipeline issue. And so it's important that we make sure that we give people of color the educational opportunities to get them into tech companies, and that we create internships and other opportunities that create access for them where they don't currently have it. And as you know, that's an area that I've been investing a lot of time and philanthropic money in over the past decade. And I think we need to do a lot more there as well. So I don't want to leave the message that I think it's a pipeline issue, because I don't, but I think it is, that is a piece of what needs to change.
And I guess on that, since we're at our FinTech Innovation Lab demo day, is there anything in particular the FinTech community could do, either the enterprise or direct-to-consumer? And then lastly, how can New York City be a leader here on this issue?
Well, I think financial services also have racial inequities. We have a bunch of companies in our portfolio that are trying to make financial services that are available to wealthy people as equally available to people who don't have access. And, you know, some of that, you know, will ultimately be helpful on racial injustice. So I do think that financial services, it's easy just to serve the wealthy customers because there's more money there. Building companies that can serve everybody, I think, is more impactful. So that's something that I think the FinTech industry, many people in the FinTech industry know that, but that's something that the FinTech industry can do. And then what New York can do, you know, kind of back to where we started, New York is a melting pot. You know, it is, we have lots of people of color in New York. And, you know, the New York tech sector, the good news about the New York tech sector is it is more diverse than most of the other regions around the United States. Not nearly as diverse as it needs to be, but more. And some of that, I think, is because it's in New York, because it's in a place that's more diverse. You ride the subway every day, and it's like you're just riding with everybody, right? It's just like, and you're talking about getting out of your bubble, right? Like, that's a good way to get out of your bubble, ride the subway.
Right.
Not a good thing necessarily to do when there's a pandemic going on, but it is a good thing to do in general.
Right, right. Well, hopefully this too, the COVID will pass, and we'll be back to more in-person gatherings. And hopefully our next year's FinTech Lab Demo Day will be able to be in person. But in the meantime, thank you, Fred, so much for the time this morning, your thoughts, your perspective, very interesting. Enjoyed the conversation, and we'll now go back to hearing from the next company. But Fred, thanks so much, and look forward to seeing you in person at some point.
Great. Thank you so much. And good luck, everybody, with Demo Day.